for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this year on April 27th, I rose in the House to convey the concerns that BC coastal communities had with the foregone conclusion that was made by this government on the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. The former parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources said the review was the most exhaustive in history of pipelines in Canada and that the additional steps made the process more rigorous. You know, one of the problems I have with this government is that their representatives can keep standing in this place and make such preposterous claims. First of all, the ministerial review panel in question admitted that it lacked the time, the technical expertise, and the resources to fill the gaps in the National Energy Board process. It ended up with little more than questions that remained unanswered. They kept no public records of hearings, admitted that the meetings were hastily organized, and confirmed that they had a serious lack of public confidence in the National Energy Board and its recommendations. I attended one of those meetings when it came to Victoria in 2016, so I witnessed how bad it was firsthand. Next, we have the internal memo from the office of the former Natural Resources Minister, which described the negotiations with First Nations as paternalistic, unrealistic, and inadequate. We now have evidence that this government had made up its mind to allow Texas-based Kinder Morgan to build a major pipeline, and that they regarded consultations with First Nations as simply an item to check off a grocery list. The government maintains that it fulfilled its legal duty to consult First Nations about the project before it announced it was approving the pipeline on November 29, 2016, but it has been revealed that in a meeting in late October 2016, a group of about 24 senior staff had been invited to Vancouver and were told by a senior government official at that meeting that their job was to find a way to get the pipeline approved. The NDP and our leader, Jagmeet Singh, have repeatedly told this Liberal government that their consultation process for the Trans Mountain Pipeline was completely inadequate and destined for failure. Unfortunately, our inquiries were repeatedly met with the same old Liberal arrogance. However, we found vindication last month as the unanimous Federal Court of Appeal ruling on Trans Mountain found that the National Energy Board's review of the project was so flawed that the federal government could not rely on it as a basis for its decision to approve the expansion. The court also concluded that the federal government failed in its duty to engage in meaningful consultations with First Nations before giving the green light to the project. In their consultations with Indigenous communities, the government's representatives limited their mandate to listening to and recording the concerns of Indigenous applicants, and then simply transmitting those concepts or concerns to decision makers. There was no meaningful two-way dialogue. This Prime Minister has repeatedly stated that no relationship is more important than that with Indigenous people, but the government's approval process for Trans Mountain exposed a calculated and predetermined strategy to get to a yes decision on this project. Indigenous people are entitled to a dialogue that demonstrates the government gives serious consideration to the specific and very real concerns they have. Is the Parliamentary Secretary prepared to still say that this project is going to get built in spite of these concerns? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank the member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford for having brought this question forward in the House today. We know that he expresses his concerns very eloquently and authentically, and that he raises points that are very important. So, Mr. Speaker, as many have said before me, there was no guidance that was given to federal representatives to justify the Trans Mountain expansion project. None at all. None. And in fact, on our side, it's the opposite. Mr. Speaker, our government made sure that the federal review of TMX included vast sweeping consultations and engagement sessions with the Indigenous peoples, and all of these were carried out in good faith. Mr. Speaker, these principles are at the very heart of a healthy democracy. Processes are more effective and wiser decisions are made when all voices are heard, and that is why our government committed to review this project thoroughly. Now, as the member pointed out, We know that the federal court told us that although we improved how we proceeded with reviews of major resource projects, there were two areas where these efforts need to be improved.
The Energy Board should have included the potential impact of marine shipping as part of its review of the TMX project. And second, the Crown failed to adequately discharge its duty to consult with Indigenous people. I think it's worth reading what Justice Eleanor Dawson stated in her written decision with respect to both of these issues. On the first one, the judge said, and I quote, "I conclude that most of the flaws asserted against the NEB's process and findings are without merit. However," the justice continued, "the board made one critical error. The board unjustifiably defined the scope of the project under review not to include project-related tanker traffic." And on Indigenous engagement, she added, and I quote, "I also conclude that Canada acted in good faith and selected an appropriate consultation framework." Acted in good faith, Mr. Speaker. Where we fell down in our duty to consult was in the state of engagement known as Phase 3. Mr. Speaker, our government has heard what the court said, we're listening, and we're taking actions to ensure that we move forward in the right way. That's why the Minister of Natural Resources has announced the first step of our planned response by instructing the NEB to revisit its recommendation on the TMX expansion, to take into account the impact of the project's increased marine transportation. I'd also draw the attention of the House to yesterday's decision by the NEB to appoint the panel for this review. We're hoping that the NEB will move efficiently. The Minister has also indicated that additional steps will be announced, and I would urge the member opposite to be patient and to wait for those details, and I will conclude with that. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Parliamentary Secretary's response. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the government, the taxpayers of Canada, are now owners of a $4.5 billion pipeline. This government has repeatedly stated that it wants to get the project built, and I think that puts the government of Canada in an inherent conflict of interest in their negotiations with First Nations. They have yet to credibly explain where all of the international buyers for our increased exported bitumen exports are lining up. They have yet to credibly state how this project is in any way going to aid our country in meeting its climate change goals. I mean, we are in 2018, and climate change is arguably the issue of the 21st century. I think it's shameful that we are letting down a young generation that's going to take this country and one day lead it through some of the biggest challenges. We are not setting them up for success, and I just hope that this government reconsiders that fact in the negotiations that go forward.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for his comments. It's more of a comment than a question, and I agree with him on climate change and protecting the environment. As millennials, that is perhaps one of our most pressing concerns, and all societies and governments are confronted with that. But I might argue that our government is ambitious with regard to its climate change plan. In terms of fighting climate change, for example, we've put a price on pollution, which should have been done a long time ago. So this government wants to ensure that pollution has a price in Canada, the same way that we are investing almost $200 billion over the next 12 years in green infrastructure and to fund public transit, to ensure that we don't have to depend as much on current types of vehicles, and that we can have quality public transit across the country. I think that's part of us protecting the environment. Thank you.